Yes, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another brand new Rugby Muscle podcast. I'm your host, as always, TJ, and I said I was going to come away from doing these intros, but this podcast definitely does require an introduction, although the man himself, Dr. Scott Stevenson, who is my guest for this podcast today, requires no introduction. This guy is an absolute genius when it comes to the realm of hypertrophy, because he is probably the most well-read and one of the most well-respected guys when it comes to the world of bodybuilding, growing muscle, and the scientific nature of all of that, but also like the practical nature of different personality types, different things available to you. That's what we start off this podcast talking about, was my experience with training, and I knew that Scott is just an absolute continual fountain of knowledge. So I knew as soon as he picked up the Zoom call that I had to hit record. So we went from there. So there was no real big introduction. The theme behind this podcast was the mechanisms of hypertrophy, exactly how you can grow, and Dr. Scott delves into the science of that. But we also go quite a bit all over the place, where we discuss all the different science around gaining muscle, personality types, and this is just a really good deep dive into the world of science and strength and conditioning, but muscle gain in general, and biology. It's we go pretty deep. I really hope you enjoy this one. I really enjoyed recording it. If you did, as always, go give us a 5-star review. This will help me, because I do want to get Dr. Scott back on. And if you have any questions, ask him on the review section, or you can ask him on the Rugby Muscle Athletes Facebook page. I really enjoyed recording this podcast, because Dr. Scott was someone I wanted to get on for a long while, so I'm really glad he could make the time for us. This is a two-parter, because we really went into depth with this. So the first part will come out it's out now. You're listening to it, right? And the second part will come out next week. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it. And with that, let's get into it. If I can just go to this place 4 times a week, I can spend more time actually training and getting it all done properly. And why not do that? Especially with because the move that's coming up at the end of the month.
Right. Yeah. I tell you what, I mean, I've got some clients now. Actually, one guy in the UK is popping in my mind, and he's been training at home. You know, he gradually built things up, and now he can go back to his gym, and he's blowing his previous lifts out of the water.
Awesome.
Which is, and what part of that, I think, really has come down to the fact that he's just been doing basic barbell shit, just been doing squats and deads, and variations thereof, because he didn't have any choice in the matter. And now he sort of redeveloped some of that basic core strength that he may have been lacking previously, and it's showing up because he's just destroying his logbook. So,
and then is he a bodybuilder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that manifests in his physique.
I've seen it. Well, I mean, I've seen it in his back, without a doubt. Like, his back is like great. I'm like, he's been moving around, like trying to find, we try to find different places for his progress pics. And finally he found a good spot in his house, and I had to go back and look at some of the other ones to see that it wasn't just the location, the lighting. And I'm like, and I think it'd been because of, I think his kid got sick, and then he had some business stuff that kind of threw him off. So it was like 3 or 4 weeks between a check-in, which was unusual, but he kept training the whole time. On target. And I'm like, what the fuck did you do to your back? What in the hell? And nothing. He just kept on training and eating, but he's doing deadlifts every week and squats every week, pretty much. Yeah. So yeah, so you can get it done, man. Like, just people. Anyway, we maybe say this for the podcast, but I see a lot of people who just they go right for the fancy shit, and they steer away from the basic core stuff, and that's meat and potatoes for many, many people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so the way I always do this podcast is I just hit, and especially I knew this was going to happen with you, that we would strike on some gold before we'd even like officially started the podcast, like quote unquote. But I always hit record like as soon as I start the Zoom, because
good call.
Yeah, we always miss out on these things. So I guess this is the start then. So
there you go. We're off and running.
I would have already introduced you beforehand anyways. So I do think that your story is rather unique at how you ended up like coaching the way you do, and how you became, like, as far as like bodybuilding gurus or hypertrophy gurus, I think you've got a like you've got to be in the top set tier of those. So how did you find yourself in this situation that you're in?
Well, guru is a 4-letter word. I don't like that a lot, but it's funny because you mentioned, that I've kind of ended up sort of in a neat place in the way that I coach, which is sort of an anti-guru type of stance.
Oh, and actually that's exactly why I wanted to get you on. It's because that's what I love about like the information that you put out. It's like there is no absolutes in anything that I don't think you've ever preached, apart from you got to do something,
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's some pretty, I think progressive overload, which is kind of an interesting notion actually in the way it can be understood as two sides of the same coin. But that's kind of a basic core one, that I think sticks. But other than that, there's so much biological individuality that although people really want, like, tell me what to do, give me a black and white, like, I don't want to have to think. Which is sometimes can be a good thing because people can overthink. But when you remove your own ability to step in and make decisions, then you're removing one of your most important tools in my mind. And I talked with someone recently who's has been training for years and years and years. He's a pro, and he was looking for, and he doesn't talk with too many people, doesn't take advice from too many people, but he was totally willing, and he meant this as the utmost compliment, to just do exactly what I said. And I said, well, the first thing that I would like to do is make sure that we include your opinion, because you've been in there during every single one of your training sessions for decades. You know what works, what doesn't work, what you can get away from, what you shouldn't be trying to continue to do. Like, your wisdom is going to far supersede mine in so many ways. And people just give that up, I think, in many cases. Maybe because it can be it's a very difficult puzzle to figure out in many cases, to just, spend years and years trying to like chip away, especially because it's a changing puzzle. Those who've competed know that like each prep can be different and each decade of your life is different. So you have to constantly be learning and changing and adapting what worked in your 20s, what worked in your 30s, what worked in your 40s. But still, you're there. So to give up on that information that you've accumulated, even if it's just like a year's worth of training, and not at least provide that to someone who's helping you, call that person a coach or what have you, I think is missing out on a lot of possibilities for progress and just enjoying the endeavor too. So,
and that enjoyment aspect, that's like one of the biggest into individualities that we're going to come across as well, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And you can't say, hey, you've got to enjoy this, or you enjoy it. Like, it's not going to work. Like, sorry.
No.
But,
I mean, the thing about, like, for instance, the best example of that I can think of off the top of my head is DC training, which was something I did for years. You read the Fortitude training book. If people don't know, that's dog crap training. Can Google that and they'll find. There's been stuff that Dante Trudel, who invented DC training, wrote that's been translated into I don't know how many languages. I think someone said like they found it in like 27 languages or something like that, and that was a decade ago.
Way.
Yeah. It's funny, like, it's just as an aside, I speak German, so I would read the German boards every once in a while, and there was like on one of the German bodybuilding boards, there was an entire Fortitude training forum that I wasn't aware of. It had been around for quite a while.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I went into the forum and I introduced myself and posted, and actually my post got deleted. I think they didn't think it was me, which I thought was funny because one of the moderators knew it was me. He'd heard me on podcast speak German, and he's like, "Oh, that's really you." But he didn't do anything about it. So I didn't go back there because I think they deleted a couple of my posts. But so yeah, things are people look to America in various countries as sort of somewhat of a guiding light because we've got so much bodybuilding history.
Yeah.
But I brought up DC training because it's something that if you really kind of like digging in and putting on your gladiator cap and going to town, and just trying to defeat gravity, so to speak, in a very sort of primitive way, then it's perfect for your mentality, because you enjoy that. It's kind of a pretty crazy ride, getting under heavier and heavier weights each time you go into the gym. We're trying to, at least for each and every exercise. It's like the penultimate progressive overload system that's available now for most people to kind of tap into. But some people that's not how they want to train. They could do, it might be physiologically, genetically, the best way for them to grow if they did everything that Dante has suggested. But if they don't like it, they won't do it. So it's kind of a moot point. You have to find the thing that you can do continuously, that's sustainable, that also, of course, produces progress, ideally, if it's gonna work for you, from a bodybuilding perspective, at least. So having fun is it's the thing about fortitude training that I'm super happy about, is that so many people just like it.
Yep, I'm one of those people.
Yeah, right. So
sure.
It may not be magical. Like, I tried to, piece some things together as best I could that made sense, given experience and the science that was available at the time, and it still holds, I think, pretty well. But the fact that you dig it probably is as important, if not more important, than some of the base. As long as you don't have an absolutely awfully constructed program that's just like asinine, which most people wouldn't enjoy necessarily, then liking the program so that you stick with it and you want to continue to get better at it, meaning you want to progress, it's got to be, I think, number one for most people.
Yeah.
So having fun is important.
It's actually one of the most important things that I actually ask my guys when I'm coaching them, is like, how are you enjoying the program? Does this look like something that you're going to be able to stick with for 4 to 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it is? And then it's part of the I have a lower level program as well that, like, it's somewhat generic, but it's geared towards rugby players. I'd say part of the appeal is that you feel like it's helping you with your rugby game when you're in the gym, which then makes it more enjoyable, which then leads to you sticking with it for, ideally years on end and getting those results. And that's one of the things, and this actually brings us back around to your sort of introduction in a really long way, is that we could talk about like how that's something that it's very difficult to measure in traditional science, like effects of enjoyment of a training program on, the results that training program is trying to produce. Like, I don't think that's something that exists, or maybe I'm wrong.
I'm trying to remember there was a study that looked into that, and I'm trying to remember the details. Yeah, there was. It was only published in the last year or two. I could probably,
really?
Yeah, if you give me a few minutes, we won't spend the time now, but I could probably dig it up and either send it to you or post it on the board.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. They have looked at that, and I'm trying to remember the details of the study, but there are a number of things that I think kind of get left out sometimes, that just questions like that, like a basic question. So the thing that is most interesting about the research, I think, at least from someone who's, trying to apply it, are what are the things about the training methodology that I can take to make my training more effective? And so, like, if you look at so what are the factors that predict muscle growth? And there's a bunch of things that I can get into, like related to satellite cell proliferation and muscle protein synthesis, and the number of different genetic markers that actually even talk about, the effects that anabolic steroids might have, things like the androgen receptor genes that you have, and things of that nature too. But I think that would be a wonderful one just to look at, is like who made the most progress. And you can imagine if, like, you're going into the lab, let's say, to train like 4 or 5 times a week or 3 times a week, and you're just dreading it. You're like, man, I don't like these guys. Like, this is not very much fun. Just can't wait to get out of there. You tend to sandbag. That's not gonna mean progress. Whereas you're like, this is so much fun. Like, this is so interesting. Like, I think I'm going to go and study this stuff. I'm going to change majors. Because a lot of times college students are the subjects in many of these studies. Are easy to get. They're on location, basically. And that person they're going to grow like a weed. they're going to make great progress. So it's an obvious one, but it would really be interesting to see, in just like as sort of a side marker, when the goal is to, as a physiologist, to look at the physiological variables that may predict outcomes, but the psychological variables like that are the things that exercise psychologists will look into. But those disciplines don't always overlap. It was funny. I could just name him because he's a phenomenal physiologist. His name was Ed Coyle, and he did a lot of, you can dig him up, Coyle, did a lot of the early research on exercise metabolism during endurance exercise. And he actually was sponsored by Gatorade for years. So they did a lot of solid research looking at carbohydrate during exercise, and was able to delineate like what's going on when like a marathon runner will bonk when they run out of glycogen, how you can prevent that by taking in carbohydrate. Like a lot of the early like basic core stuff that now is applied by endurance athletes, cyclists, and runners pretty much universally. And he was talking about, like, every once in a while you get asked a question, and he literally laughed because he was very self-aware. But I remember him just talking about the brain as a big black box. Like we just can't, we can't really, there's just nothing there, like that we can really get at. And that he knew that wasn't really the case, but that's what physiologists do. They just say, we're not worry about that and look for the things in the body. But there's a guy who's actually started off as and is still an exercise physiologist by the name of Timothy Noakes, who's from South Africa.
South African guy, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. He's a phenomenal guy. And he's got a really nice article. He's done some of this research where he basically sums up various psychological parameters that seem to be the way he sums up. He makes a really strong argument is that the brain literally is the governor on performance and our psychological perceptions of things. So like you can do things like have people like cyclists who are really well trained. These are like, top of their sport, top of the endeavor type athletes, and have them go with a pacer, like if they're cyclists. And if the pacer goes a little bit faster than them. So they're riding along and they've got like this, they're competing against, the computer, who's another, virtual cyclist, so to speak. They will go faster and they'll maintain that pace. They'll do it. And you can improve that performance that way. And take this into the gym, like, pardon my French, but I, have said before, it would be my ideal training partner is someone who would, quote unquote, make me his bitch every day.
Yeah.
Because he'd be bigger and stronger and like just basically be able to outdo me in a way that wouldn't force me to try to, do stupid shit in the gym, but that would, force me to try to, would have that psychological effect that you just can't get if you don't have another person there.
Yeah, so, and that kind of goes back to progressive overload being one of the key tenets, like, or maybe the key thing if we're trying to build muscle. And then that would go back to like, especially when you're looking at professional athletes, like even because I always think about like rugby players, about how you don't see any skinny professional rugby players. It just doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And even positions where you would imagine that hypertrophy isn't that much of a benefit, like they're still in there. And I think it's just because when they're getting in their strength and conditioning workouts, like they'll be relatively competitive with each other, and then they just got so much recovery in place that they're always still going to be able to grow. But you could also then look at it from the other side of the coin, is that maybe they're just professional rugby players already because they're already in decent shape, or they have good genetics. And obviously genetics is what, even more so of a governing factor, because you have people that, essentially just turn 18 and are already jacked and everything, and they've never even stepped foot in the gym.
Yeah. I mean, I would suspect it's probably a combination, interaction of the two.
Yeah.
If you look at like, American football players are a good example. You've got sort of body, and actually if you read, there's a book called The Sports Gene that goes into this pretty substantially. It looks at things like a great example is Michael Phelps, and he has relative arm length to leg length that's extraordinary. And I think, I don't know if he actually qualifies for this, but there's a connective tissue disorder called Marfan syndrome, where that's something that you see. And that relative long arm length to leg length is extremely advantageous for swimming, because of what the arms do relative to the legs when you're in the water. So you see all these phenotypes, these body types, call them somatotypes, not thinking like in the terms of endo, ecto, and mesomorph type of thing, but you see these being the dominant, advantageous way in which the body is sort of the phenotype of the body is for different sports. So yeah, rugby is like a combination. It's kind of like this is an aside relative to bodybuilding and I think even rugby too. Like CrossFit, the best CrossFit athletes have ridiculous physiques.
Yeah.
And so the thing that we just sort of assume is a cause and effect there, that training with CrossFit made them look like pretty high level bodybuilders. But it just so happens, I think, in many of those, like those are great athletes. If you look at their background, they were just genetically gifted in the first place.
Yeah, a lot of them come from like a track and field background or a swimming background, like already had some success at a sport that requires like some sort of ridiculous physiology in the first place to be successful.
Right. Yeah. So you take your average person who doesn't have those genetic gifts, who doesn't look like that, and they want to look literally, they want to gain more muscle and drop body fat. And we sort of know that if you really want to do that, the best way to do that is to train like a bodybuilder. Do bodybuilding training. Now, not that you can't get really, really fit doing CrossFit. It's friggin' tremendous as long as you don't hurt yourself in the process. People tend to go overboard. That's kind of another topic there. It's injury potential can be high there if folks don't know what they're doing. This is not that it's always the case, but probably for the average person who wants to gain muscle mass, CrossFit's not going to be the way to do that.
Right.
And that might even be a segue into the mechanisms of muscle growth. But those people who are the best CrossFitters just have that natural gift for lots of muscle mass, and it helps them because they have that, and they're doing things that are sort of a muscular endurance or even sort of an endurance type events, and having more muscle, basically having a bigger engine to drive that performance that may not be one that necessarily stimulates having a bigger engine. It's not the best for muscle hypertrophy along the spectrum of potential exercise stimuli that could provoke muscle growth. Just means that those athletes are going to be better at it, but it doesn't mean that you should train like they are currently training in order to look like them. So that's
beautiful.
And I think CrossFit's phenomenal because it gets that sort of, there's a collective, it taps into our tribalism, which we're missing to some degree.
Yeah.
At least sort of in a healthy way in society. We've got plenty of it floating around now that's not probably helping us out as a species. We're going to be around for too much longer, but
yeah, for sure,
it creates a nice, good group, cohesive, and those guys just love each other. They have a blast from what I've seen. It can be a little bit cultish too sometimes, but overall, I think it's a good thing. So I'm not knocking CrossFit, but I've always just found that kind of interesting because that's a big selling point, which I think is a little bit of a physiological misnomer.
I think there's two different types of CrossFit, in my opinion. Like there's the CrossFit, the local box that mum goes to after dropping the kids off at school and gets in good shape and, does something that is a lot better than just standing on the elliptical for 30 minutes a day or whatever. And then there's the CrossFit Games, which is essentially, it's like a showcase. You could also compare it to bodybuilding, where it's like the showcase of what the human body is capable of. And, there's obviously training and whatnot and other things that go into it. But I also just think it is just a show. Like, you look on the Mr. Olympia stage, like those guys aren't training overly different to probably thousands of people, as I'm sure you can attest to. They're not necessarily training harder or any special way compared to thousands of different bodybuilders all around the world, but they're showcasing what the body is capable of at elite levels. And then that goes perfectly into your, sort of what causes hypertrophy and the sort of basics and your entire background, how you got into it.
Yeah, there's a one of my favorite talks that I give is I entitled it "Why You Don't Look Like a Pro," and then the subtitle is something like why you don't play in the NBA, why you're not you know a Major League Baseball player, why you're not a world-class concert pianist, why you aren't a rocket scientist with NASA, et cetera, et cetera. All these things that people really know. You got to have some genetic gifts in order to be top of the field, top, best in the world for those sorts of things. And at the, one of the first slides I have in there, I went back, it's been a few years now, but I went back and traced the histories of the top 10 of the Mr. Olympia. And like the average time from first show to getting their pro card was 3.5 years. And actually, I think it was Sean Roden and one other competitor had like a 5 or 7 year layoff or time away from the sport. And so if you took those years out, there's some personal things happened. Then it was like 2.5 years. So first show to pro card. And this is a few years ago. Now you can get a pro card much, and this is in bodybuilding too. So those are genetic gifts. Like you don't just like the average person doesn't ever earn a pro card in bodybuilding, much less in 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a huge genetic component there. They just grow better. A lot of the times the stories you hear about pros is sometimes we'll just like they were in the gym and someone said, "Hey, there's a show. You getting ready for the show this weekend?" Like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what that is. Like, you want me to stand up in my underwear in front of people? What kind of crazy question is that? But they decided to go do it and they win.
Yeah, did you hear Ronnie Coleman he was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he said the same thing. He said the guy who owned the gym that he went to just said, "Hey, listen, I'll give you free membership if you compete and show off my gym."
Right. Brian Dobson, yeah.
Hi, guys. I just wanted to jump in here to tell you that if you're enjoying this podcast and you want to become a better athlete, then you can go ahead and visit rugby-muscle.com and pick up any of our free goodies. That is the 50 free rugby conditioning sessions, the Physique Nutrition Crash Course video series, the supplement guide, and newly added is a macro calculator. Yes, that's right, a macro calculator where you will be able to work out your protein, carbs, fat, and calories that you should be eating on a daily basis to give you a guide as to where to start your diet from. This will help in conjunction with your 50 free conditioning sessions to build you out a decent little plan that will enable you to take control of your training and use effective training and nutrition to become a better athlete. All of that stuff and more can be found at rugby-muscle.com or rugby-muscle.com/macros for the macro breakdown.
And he said they're out like walking, they're at a park and there's like a little jungle gym there. And he looked over, he told me this story. I'm like, oh man. And she's like, I think she's like 9, maybe 10. And she's like, "Daddy, this is fun." And she bangs out like 10 pull-ups, like just like playing around, cause that's what she just had that in her, She had daddy's genetics. So yeah, so there is a lot. Like as far as do you want to dig in on like mechanisms of muscle growth or what?
Yeah, let's do it. So yeah, okay. I think we can look at mechanisms of muscle growth to start with and sort of introduce that, and then we can sort of go from there.
Yeah, well, it's a still very, very valid research or review article that Brad Schoenfeld put out. God, it's been a while now, but he sort of broke it down into 3 main things. And there's some information that I can kind of throw in to update that. He's actually got another review that he did, which is much more molecular biology based. But the 3 mechanisms that he sort of put together were tension, which is one that most people are really pointing to is just simply sort of a basic understanding is that you go in the gym and you pick up a weight. Let's say you can lift 10 or 12 times and no more. That is so far beyond what most people would do or have ever done if they haven't lifted weights in terms of what they're picking up, the load that is being placed on the muscles that are doing the lifting, that it's just absolutely extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Think of like, let's say, the average person, if they don't have a manual labor type job, they might pick up groceries, even I'm one of those guys, like I go to the grocery store and I see how few trips I can take. So I carry 8 bags in each hand. but even then, that's as many as I can fit. And it's still maybe, 60 pounds in a hand.
Yeah.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
and I'm dragging them in. That's most people would just do like one grocery bag, so 10 pounds, something like that. But those people could shrug 200 pounds, perhaps. They really pushed it. So we're talking about like a many-fold increase in the tension that's produced when you go in the gym compared to the thing that you were ever really be uh, uh, have to do during day-to-day life. And you don't see people. It's not socially acceptable, at least in most first world countries, to be to be screaming and yelling, or pushing so hard, that you can no longer lift something and you're literally dropping it.
Mm-hmm.
So the effort levels are that high. So the tension is just tremendous, and that can't really even be it can't be overstated, I don't think. The other big one is metabolic stress. So when you have maximal efforts like that, or near maximal efforts, the energy demand there, so the rate at which you need to provide ATP just to fuel those contractions, is also extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the interesting findings is, and they've done this in Japan now for many years. Have you heard of Katsu training, or blood flow
Yes.
restriction? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, because I mean they do this. It was um, sort of invented as a rehab technique, and they have special Katsu clinics there in Japan
Oh,
where they
really?
employ this. Yeah. That's sort of the specialty. So if you blood flow restrict, you don't want to completely exclude, but if you restrict the blood flow to skeletal muscle during exercise, you prevent the release of metabolites, and so metabolites remaining there is what you would then call metabolic stress. So the pH will go down, lactic acid or lactate will accumulate, and then if you're looking at glycolysis, so the main energy supply system that's going to provide ATP during high energy demand, high effort contractions, like when you're lifting weights,
Mm-hmm.
those basically that you're going to slow down the extent to which you can provide ATP there, because you have to have movement through those enzymatic reactions in order to make the ATP. And if
Right.
you metabolites get out into the bloodstream, carried away, then you reduce the rate that you can produce the ATP. What that means then is you cause fatigue in those fibers that are being used. And in order to keep doing the exercise, whatever it might be, you have to call upon other fibers.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that was really kind of interesting is that when people were first looking at this, is you can like lift really light loads. So let's say someone's they're mending a broken bone and they've been casted for a while. You want to kind of bring back the muscle around the joint that might have been isolated or immobilized. You can use really light loads with some blood flow restriction. And instead of using X number of muscle fibers or motor units to do that, the blood flow restriction means that you will call upon motor units that wouldn't normally be called upon until you got to until you're lifting heavier loads, at least initially, or until you pushed really hard and got closer to muscular failure. So let's say you've got 100 motor units available, and without blood flow restriction, for X number of reps, you might end up calling upon 30, 40, or 50 of those, something like that. Maybe you start with 30, by the end of the set, you get to 50. With the blood flow restriction, you might start in the initial set and use 30 of those. And then by the end of that set, you might use 60. And the standard protocol that they use in a lot of the research is they just leave the blood flow restriction in place. So have you ever done blood flow restriction before?
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, it's pretty fucking painful. It's a categorically different stimulus, man.
Mm-hmm.
Calves are like one of the worst. Like calves are just mind
Oh, the
boggling.
worst. Yeah,
Yeah. And I have to
absolutely.
say, yeah, just like as an aside, there is some possibility of a clot happening because you're basically slowing down the movement of blood flow through the venous system. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just be aware of that. I'm not suggesting people go out and do this now and try to best like what's Mario's last name? There's some people I'm blanking on his name, but there's some Mario Novo is actually someone Novo. You can look him up. He's sort of at least in the social media sphere, I think in general too, he's getting to be quite a well-known figure and an authority on blood flow restriction. He uses it in a physical therapy setting. in various ways. So if you want to dig into that, just find any of his podcasts and he'll inundate you with all the mechanisms that are involved here, what's going on.
But the point being, it's an advanced technique, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's pretty simple to do once you figure it out. There have been studies suggesting you can just sort of use like knee wraps and that sort of thing, and you can replicate. But then there's mixed opinions on that, and I would listen to what Mario has to say. He likes to be very particular with that, so you can control the pressure. There are devices, medical devices you can get, basically similar to a blood pressure cuff, so kind of a sphygmomanometer that will allow you to control that pressure, because just for the sake of safety.
Yeah,
you don't want the blood to completely pool. There was a guy once that I've heard some funny stories. There's a guy once who would just leave the wraps around his legs for like a half an hour leg training session.
Jesus.
Yeah, and I mean, he couldn't have had them on there too long, because what the pain's like if you
That's what I was thinking. I was like, that's he's either like not got them on tight enough or not like doing any.
Right. It's just like so I don't know what he was actually accomplishing. You maybe just sort of left them on there thinking it might help a little bit. Who knows? And then you can wrap them too tight. You get all amped up. This is going to hurt. You just tighten it down. Like, I got to get, like, you don't want to progressively overload how tight you're wrapping, for instance, if you're going to use that procedure. But if you do that, then you could end up wrapping too tight. So that shouldn't be something that changes over time.
And that's one of the things as well, is that, like, if you're questioning yourself as to whether you've wrapped it too tight and you're questioning whether it's safe or not, then like, how much can you really apply to the training? Because it's going to hurt. But especially if you're like not overly trained, and especially in this area, and it's, it could actually, take away from the training that you're trying to produce anyway, because this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a roundabout way of causing something that you can cause just with higher rep or burnout style training anyway.
Yes. And that's kind of what I'm bringing. We'll bypass some of the BFR stuff, but let me say one thing. The way that they would do this in the research was you do a set of 30, but leave the wraps on. So with that sort of that example I was talking with 100 motor units, let's say, you come back for that second set and those metabolites are still there. So you've got fatigue fibers to start with. So you might start that set using 50 of those motor units and end up with 80. And the next one, it might be 60 and end with 90. And you're using a very light load, but you've altered the recruitment pattern. And this is the interesting thing then, is that because of doing that, you're actually going to use those high threshold motor units you wouldn't otherwise call upon, and produce tension in those in a way that you might not, at least if you did the same number of reps with the same load without the blood flow restriction, which would be easier. But you make the very important point that you can do low load, high rep, like 30% or 50% of 1 rep max, and take those sets to failure. The generally research suggests going to failure is the way to ensure you're going to get good growth. And those are brutal in and of themselves. Without a doubt. So high rep sets, like sets of 20 and 30, you can get great muscle growth from those as well. So
you can also do that with like slower reps as well, right?
Yeah, if you do, if somewhere around the data I've been able to dig up, if you around 40 to 60% of an isometric maximal voluntary contraction, so maybe half of what max force would be for a static contraction, is enough to prevent blood flow into the muscle, because you've got more tension, more force in the muscle, or more pressure in the muscle than can be overcome by the arterial flow into the muscle. So that you don't get muscle in or blood in, you don't get blood out. So maintaining tension during a set is will effectively bring about the same thing. And that's why, I think you probably know this from having read the Fortitude training book, that's one of the reasons why I suggest people maintain continuous repetitions, because you then you change the activation pattern. That tendency that you have, like when the set's getting really hard, and like if you just stop, took a little bit of a break, a breath or two, and let the muscle relax. Like the worst case scenario, you see people do this when they're squatting, they'll lock out their knees to try to let their quads, get a little bit of a break. That's obviously, that could run into problems. But
on the leg press.
Yeah, the leg press.
You'll get some bad videos if you try researching that. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Exactly. It makes me cringe just thinking about it, man.
Yeah.
So, but that allows blood flow, and that clears out the metabolites just enough to remove some of that fatigue, so you can get a few more reps. So if you go on to Elite FTS, there's an article that I wrote called "Rust Proofing the Iron Warrior," and I've got in there just some examples of ways that you could basically do kind of a blood flow restriction type of scenario without having to put on a tourniquet or something to reduce the blood flow. You just would do a set and then hold the weight. So pick a really light weight and hold the weight in isometric for a 30 or a 60-second contraction. And then start moving the weight again. So you maintain continuous tension. And that will be enough. And those are very, very difficult too. Those are brutal, but you can do that. And I can't remember, there's a multitude of ways you can configure that, but you're doing the same thing basically. And that's a way for someone, in this case, this was an article about older guys who've got, joints that have been beaten up for years, who want to find a way to stimulate growth without using the heavy loads that tear up their joints, overly stress the tendons. So kind of taking a page out of the Katsu training, but instead of having that risk of a too tight tourniquet, you're just basically doing another type of resistance training. You're just doing isometrics between regular coupled concentric eccentric contractions, normal reps. And
love it.
Those are another type of pain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I have to ask you before we move on to the next hypertrophy mechanism, because when we're talking about metabolites with training and quote unquote the pump, we often hear that that's only training slow twitch quote unquote muscle fibers, and you'll hear a lot of people say, well, that's not overly quote unquote functional. You have any thoughts on that argument that people sort of put forth?
There's a little bit of research, some of it's kind of obscure, suggesting that you may get some preferential growth in type 1 versus type 2 fibers, but it hasn't been like the case is not closed. No. But the more important thing is that basically the way in which muscle is activated is very, very smart. The nervous system is very, very intelligent in trying to prevent fatigue. So there's an orderly progression. It's called Henneman's size principle, sort of a basic thing you learn in like a muscle exercise physiology, especially if there's a muscle physiologist like myself loves to talk about this shit. So you'll hear this come up all the time. But basically you start off with low threshold motor units and at the beginning of a set, and you'll actually, the nervous system will rotate through those and then add, as fatigue ensues, add more of the moderate, higher threshold motor units. And at the same time, you're also going to see some change in firing rate, going from lower to higher firing rates. But then as the muscle fatigues, the nervous system will actually lower the firing rates too, because a fatigued muscle acts like a slower muscle, which doesn't need higher firing rates to produce optimal tension. In fact, it would be wasteful to do that.
Right.
But you move from these lower threshold, which typically are the type 1, endurance-oriented, kind of postural types of motor units and fibers, to the high threshold, the type 2s. And if you take a set to failure and you're someone who's motivated to maximally activate and call upon all the motor units that are available, you will have called upon the type 1s and the type 2s, the low and all the way from the most easily recruited motor units and the fibers, which are type 1s, to the most difficult to recruit ones, which you'd only get. You get those near the end of a set. And so one thing people will say is that once you get above maybe like 80%, a lot of this data is hard to translate into like what you typically would do in the gym if you're bodybuilding, because these activation patterns are most typically studied like in muscles of the hand, where they can get access to the nerve. They stick a little electrode in there and they can isolate a single neuron or several neurons and watch their activity as people do increased force or do fatiguing tasks and that kind of stuff. When you get in a situation where you've got dynamic contractions, like a knee extension, let's say, then people start to do EMGs and try to, transform the EMG signal. That gets to be a little bit messy. But generally, when you have a heavier load, you have to use more muscle. And that means you're going to end up calling upon a lot of those motor units that are available. The nervous system, like, for instance, if you're going to do a set of 12 or 10, you might call upon almost all of the motor units, if not all of them, that are there in those first couple reps.
Mm-hmm.
The nervous system also is going to turn some of them off and turn other ones on and kind of spread the load. So it's sort of like if you have 100 workers that, let's say you've got 100 motor units total. You might call upon in the first couple reps 100 of those motor units, but you're never going to have all of them activating at maximal firing rates, at least at the very beginning, because you don't need to. And it's not a maximal effort. The first rep or two isn't anywhere near the effort of the last rep on a set of 12 to failure, let's say. Mm-hmm. So you'll have some of those turning on and off, and it will be sort of something that literally in the first maybe couple reps, and this is kind of speculative because a lot of this is from hand muscles, but you're going to see almost all those motor units being activated with the heavier loads, but not all at the same time, and certainly not all at the maximal firing rate. But as you progress through the set, you're gonna see more of those being turned on all at the same time and maybe being synchronized. It's a term you'll hear people say. And then the firing rates will increase. And as you increase firing rates, you increase force as well. So by the end of the set, you're gonna see maximal firing rates, which could even be a little bit lower than maximal if there's some fatigue that's there. But the optimal firing rate was probably higher than what you started with. And if you're someone who's really able to dig in and activate everything that's available, motor unit, muscle-wise, all those motor units are going to be going in a coordinated fashion to move the load. And that's the thing. Like, you've got concentric and eccentric contractions. And so concentrics are going to be harder than eccentrics. There's actually different areas in the motor cortex that are turned on during each of those contractions. So you can see literally as you lift, one set of motor units will be activated, and as you lower, a different set will be activated, probably more type 2s, if anything, during the lowering. So there's a really highly complex situation where the brain's coordinating things. You've got different muscles that are probably being activated depending on the joint signals that are coming back to the spinal cord, just to keep the joints in line. Let's say you've got something like the quad where you've got a medialis and a lateralis that are keeping the patella going in the right direction and not subluxing. So you're going to have, and you can even take example of someone who's really lean and you're doing a knee extension. And you ever look down, you look at the quad, and you can see like all these, people say it's the fibers, but you can see the fascicles and the motor, it's like turning on, like the whole quad is like twittering all over the place. Those are fibers coming on and off, and motor units actually coming on and off. So you're going to have some of that happening, especially at the beginning, but probably even throughout even a maximal effort, because you have to have, if you didn't have some coordination amongst all those motor units, it was just like all blast on like the whole time, then like for a knee extension, you would just go to max extension, you just stay there. That'd be it. Like,
yeah.
So you got to have some
immediately go to lockout, like you would do, like if you've been if you've had the electrode impulses, yeah.
If you used E-stim, you just like lock it out. And there's some funny. I've got some funny stories that I've been told, because I've done a lot of E-stim on myself. I used that for my dissertation work, and I did a lot of that when I was in grad school. And like for instance, my advisor Gary Dudley, who I dedicated the Fortitude training book to, he told me the story once. He had built something that we built again when we were in grad school, so we could travel and do some isometric knee extension work. He had one of these chairs that he built. He just wood, and some, just angled it so you make kind of a chair out of it and hook up a load cell and connect it to a computer. You strap yourself down and then put the electrodes on, and then go to town trying to figure out whatever you want to figure out about muscle fatigue or what have you. And with a lot of these machines, they're not really, they're designed for PT settings. So there's a lot of safety features built in. So in order to get to the current, which dictates how much force you have, in this particular machine, there's a little wheel you'd have to like roll all the way up, and we're using a lot of current, so it'd be like every time you have to roll the thing back up. It's just like, so they need fatiguing the muscle going from 0 to whatever milliamps you need to put on the machine. So he would just like, and I ended up doing the same thing. He just pull the plug, just leave the machine on and pull the plug out. You sort of bypass the safety mechanisms. And he said once he had the thing up near like really max force, and like literally had to have himself strapped down in the machine, and he was just using one leg, and he just blanked. He wrote something down. It was getting late, and he just sort of spaced, and he was getting ready to do his next test, trial run or whatever he was up to. And he plugged the thing in with max milliamps on there, and he literally launched himself forward because his leg was strapped down and his knee extended, and his whole body came up off the chair, and the whole thing flipped, and he landed on his face with the chair on top of him.
Jesus.
Yeah. So that's maximal, all-out, uncontrolled muscle contraction that E-stim would do. Your brain doesn't do that. Obviously, your brain would, would change that before you end up doing a somersault and broke your neck. So another guy was trying to add some stim to doing side laterals with dumbbells. And one of the things that happens with the electrodes, because it's non-physiological, is they will move over what's called a motor point, which is you'll see if when you measure EMGs, you get greater activity there. And that has to do with the spatial configuration of the nerve underneath in the muscle. So if you put electrode you're going to use to stimulate the muscle with, that electrode will produce more force the closer the electrode is to that motor point, because it's getting more neurons, and that's how the electrodes actually stimulate the muscle. It's through the neurons, not the fibers themselves. So he really didn't take that into account. So he had his arm at his side, and he was turn up a little bit of stim. He's like, okay, so I'll turn the stim on. He grabbed his dumbbells, and then he did the side lateral. And as he did that, the electrode slid over his delts, over to the motor point, and he couldn't bring his arms back down because there's so much juice. So he said he dropped the dumbbells, and he had to do like a max, like most muscular crab pose in order to get his hands down and like turn off the machine, because he had so much contraction there in his delts. So yeah, the body is doing all sorts of things all at once. So it's an oversimplification there with the 100 motor unit thing, but the bottom line is that you can do those higher rep sets, and if you take them to failure, you're definitely going to get a lot of type 2 fiber activation. And some of the research suggests maybe a little more type 1 than type 2, the higher the rep the sets are. One of the things that some of the people sort of don't pay attention to, which I like to bring up because the puzzle is pretty complex, is some of the early stuff with bodybuilders when they did biopsies. And actually Jose Antonio has pointed this out in a nice review on muscle hyperplasia, is that some of these early studies found that bodybuilders had really big muscles relative to the control normal untrained people that they would also do biopsies in and look at muscle size in, had lots of type 1s that were normal size. So average size type 1s, but lots of them. So either they started off with a whole bunch of really, really small type 1s and then made those all bigger, or something about, and this is like, back in like the 90s where everyone was training pretty much like, except for people who were Mensarians doing, heavy duty or HIT, most bodybuilders were doing Arnold Schwarzenegger inspired programs with lots and lots of volume. And so either they start off with really itty bitty small type 1 fibers and grew them to average size, and in doing so got big muscles that were bodybuilder size, high level competitive bodybuilder size, or maybe something about their training was such that they ended up getting some of those maybe type 2s into type 1s, and that can happen. People talk about the being impossible. That's definitely been documented with different exercise stimuli. Mm-hmm. E-stim will especially do it, that's for sure. And they may have had some hyperplasia, which has also been documented in animal models. So, and there's while I'm rolling here, there's the most impressive muscle growth study in the literature that I know of was one that Jose Antonio did. Have you heard of the weighted stretch model they use with quail, where they hang weights?
The bugs.
So he did that. Like normally they just take a load and like 30% of body weight, something like that, just hang it. And then they would, they monitor whatever the protein expression or muscle size, fiber type along the course of the muscle growth. And so like after a week, they take some of the animals and they'd sacrifice those and make a measurement. They wait another week. And that's how they make their measurements. It was just kind of left the weight on there. Well, he decided, let's employ a little progressive overload here and recovery, which we know is important for bodybuilders. So you just can't train every single day and not end up being overtrained eventually. So he had them. He took I think he did like 2 days on. It was a nice protocol, but he had a day or two off, and each time he would come back, he'd add a little bit of a load to the weight. So he progressively overloaded and had off days to allow the muscle growth to happen. And it was like maybe it's like 350% increase in muscle wet weight in like a month.
Jesus.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's like absolutely ridiculous. 250, 350. There's a different group. I think it was 350. I can look that one up too. But the interesting thing that happened was they started to shift towards type 1. Type 1, like this is a continuous tension. So it's not like going to the gym and lifting for an hour or two and then stopping. Like the weight's always there for the day or two that it's on. So that's a continuous endurance kind of stimulus. And it makes sense to have more type 1 endurance-oriented myosin in those fibers. So they started seeing a shift from type 2 towards type 1. And as the muscle grew, initially, the fibers got bigger, exactly what you'd expect. But then after 2 or 3 weeks, they actually found the muscle kept on growing, but the average fiber size started getting smaller. So, which suggests hyperplasia, because the fibers were getting smaller, but the muscle's getting bigger, so you're probably getting more fibers, and they're just smaller. And that makes sense because when you're doing endurance-oriented things, like a lot of these bodybuilders would do, training in an Arnold-like way with really short rest intervals, you've got metabolic stress, metabolic demand, a pump like all the time throughout the entire, like those guys would just train until they lost their pump and they'd be done, but it might be 20 or 30 sets. So you're constantly trying to get blood in and out so you can clear those metabolites. And if you have really, really big cells, then you have a big distance from the capillaries that are outside the cell to get oxygen in to the mitochondria, because you're going to have some oxygen being used during the recovery periods for sure, and get carbon dioxide and metabolites that are produced out. So it's a diffusion distance across those cells to get those things in and out. It makes sense if you have a stress that requires blood flow and getting oxygen in and clearing metabolites out to lessen that diffusion distance. This is what you see with endurance training per se. They don't have big fibers. In some cases, you see some of the best ones they do. But so what happened, at least what seemed to happen maybe with these bodybuilders, from like Allway was one of the researchers who did this. Jose points them out in one of his review articles. And in this quail study is you got a lot of type 1 fibers that were a little bit smaller than what you might expect given how big the muscle was. And type 1 smaller fibers are better oriented for endurance type activity, like a high volume bodybuilding training or this crazy stretch overload, which you really would never do as a person. You couldn't get away with that on a whole body level. But the muscles were gigantic too. So we tend to think sort of things, we compartmentalize muscle growth is like, well, you do endurance and the fibers, unless you're completely untrained, you're going from, couch potato to doing something, you don't really get much in terms of muscle growth. Endurance athletes aren't known, look at marathon runners, they're not known for having big fibers because there's not a demand there. But you can actually get lots of type 1 endurance-oriented fibers and large muscle mass at the same time too. That's one program that you can see in people with big muscles, with large muscles, big muscle mass. You look at powerlifters, they tend to have really, really big type 2s. A lot of these people may have been gifted in that way, but that's what you tend to see from more strength training oriented, progressive overload focused, less like high volume, higher reps, short rest interval type of training. And that produces muscle growth as well. So you've got different ways to the same outcome in terms of the muscle size that could evoke different changes in terms of what you see in muscle fiber type and other aspects of the muscle performance. So the muscle is just, plasticity is the term for the adaptability that I'm talking about here. And it's really phenomenal what the muscle's capable of. It's from a survival standpoint, literally your cardiovascular system is super important. Obviously your brain, that's what, kind of brought us to the place we are, as being able to inhabit pretty much any terrain on the planet. But the muscle has to be able to adapt pretty well, to handle whatever stresses the environment might bring on us. And it's just incredible that it's got such a range of possible programs that can be set into place to produce what you think were kind of like contradictory ways of adapting, both endurance and size at the same time. Like those seem like those are, it'd be a paradox, but the muscle can figure out and it can do it if that's the stimulus that it's presented with.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed that episode of the Rugby Muscle Podcast, then I've got a quick little request and a potential prize giveaway for you if you do said request. All I want you to do is go to Apple Podcasts and type up a 5-star review. Just your general opinions of the podcast would be great feedback, but also helps us reach higher rankings, get more exposure, allow me to attract more guests and devote more time to developing a better all-around podcast experience for you. All you have to do, once again, is go and give us a 5-star review on whatever podcast service you use. Let me know that you've got it, and then every single week I'll be selecting one review to give away a free prize. That free prize will be either 1 free month of Team Rugby Muscle, that's our world-class strength and conditioning program app delivered directly to your phone, or if that doesn't interest you, then we've got 1 free consultation where I'll go over your training program, your nutrition, and advise you how to best plan for your goals. Even if none of those things interest you, it's still doing me a solid and helping the podcast grow by going and giving us a 5-star review. There's no real excuse. It takes like 1 minute and that helps the show out exponentially. So I'd really appreciate it if you could do that. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one.